Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Steve. Steve, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Tom. I'm Steve Yurko. I'm the CEO of apexanalytix. It's good to be with you.
Thank you, Steve. And what is apexanalytix?
Our company does ultimate supplier management. What that means is supplier information, supplier risk, and supplier working capital opportunity management. The three main offerings that we have are service and a technology solution that identifies overpayments, reaches out to the suppliers and recovers those overpayments for a contingent fee. The software piece of that solution does all that in an automated way. And we do that for about 200 of the Fortune 1000, been in business 35 years. The second piece of the company, the second offering, is a supplier portal application, which does the ultimate supplier information and risk management. And that's in use by 90 of the world's largest companies. And it manages the onboarding of that supplier, validating their information around the world across over 1,000 different databases. And then monitors for risk, cyber risk, and other types of bank account fraud and other types of risk. And then the third thing that we do is through these first two offerings, we just get access to a massive amount of data, about $9 trillion in invoices, tens of millions of updated supplier records from our customers. And we use advanced technology, some statistical models, some AI engines, large language models to consolidate and curate all of that vendor master data and create what we believe is the world's most accurate supplier information database in the world. And we sell access to that and use it, and it's used as a backbone of our other solutions to make sure that we're doing a great job for customers.
You're keeping them honest.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. If I were to ask you about supply chain risks, we're at the start of 2024. What do you think are the kind of top supply chain risks for organizations these days?
Yeah, I mean, by far, Tom, I think, and this is across our customer base and almost every prospect that we talk to, by far the biggest risk to the supply chain from a sustainability perspective and from a going concern perspective is the compromising of emails and bad actors using those compromised emails to gain access to systems for the world's buyers. And so bank account fraud and changing bank accounts and using that to steal money is really one of the biggest disruptors at our clients. And it's not getting better. By the way, I had the opportunity to interview General David Petraeus, and he was the director of the CIA, and obviously has had a great military career. And his point around supply chain resiliency and the importance of protecting the supply chain is that when it's compromised, these bad actors are not donating it to UNICEF or the Red Cross. They're using it for really nefarious purposes. And so it's really important. It's an important topic, an important thing for large companies to protect against, because there's a lot of evil being done with what's done with the theft there.
Sure, of course. And you talked a little bit about the fact that you're using AI and large language models. Can you talk to me a little bit about, technology and automation in supplier risk management, how that's working out?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's several components that we utilize and that we apply towards the three solution sets that I talked to you about. One is the statistical models to predict which of the suppliers have billing issues or have other issues that could disrupt the procure to pay process or the supply chain for our customer, the buyer. So across, all of these transactions, across all the interactions we have with suppliers, we use technology to predict which suppliers ought to be really looked at really, really hard as we move to a new client, for example, in a new project. The other thing that we're using advanced technology for is in curating the data to create what we believe is the most accurate and up-to-date vendor master record. So there's data coming from, I mentioned, over 1,000 different data sources, plus, Tom, when we do the recovery of the funds of an overpayment for our client, we're interacting with that supplier, sometimes over the phone, sometimes electronically, and our technology, the large language models, pick up that activity, and we do fun things with it. For example, we can know if there's been a contact change at a supplier recently. That can get expanded throughout all of our different data sets. Or, for example, if we want to know a particular contact and whether they pick up the phone or respond to email and what their preference is. And if they do pick up the phone, what time of the day is most likely that they'll do that. So
Interesting.
there's some really interesting applications of that technology to help us serve our clients better, for sure.
Nice. And of course, this is the Sustainable Supply Chain podcast. So we should really be talking about sustainability. So talk to me a little bit about the evolving landscape of ESG compliance, for example, and how that's impacting supply chains.
Yeah, Tom. I mean, the second solution that I talked to you about that is our supplier portal, supplier information risk management. One of the key categories that we're helping our clients with is around sustainability. And the definition that we use around sustainability is is their supplier, is their supply chain environmentally responsible? Are they socially responsible? Do they have good governance around their incentive plans aligned up with shareholder objectives? But also, is the supply chain resilient? And as we think through the different categories of supply chain resilience, you have this issue of, boy, as a large company, I need to know who my suppliers are and which suppliers supply which suppliers. So that's kind of a first level of care of analysis that we want to do for our clients. So which suppliers supply which suppliers. The second level deals with, well, what's the location types of those suppliers. So it matters greatly whether that's a business office or distribution center or manufacturing center in terms of potential weather event that's coming and the disruption. Right. So the second level is what's the location type of that supplier. The third level is what is the main product that's being traded between suppliers through the end tiers in the supply chain. And so our platform of our confidential and connected platform where suppliers and customers can interact, it enhances the ability for those suppliers to represent through their supply chain where they're getting their key products and identifying that, so that our client, the ultimate buyer, can get a feel for when supply chain disruption can be predicted. And then the fourth level is really, when it gets down to bill of materials. I know, Tom, you have a background in ERP, and ultimately, there are solutions out there that take a look at, boy, all through the supply chain at each level. What are the bill of materials, and those bill of materials being shared, and what are the part numbers as part of that bill of material, and when there are supply chain disruptions, how to predict that and to get out ahead of that as a buyer so that you can do supply chain planning. And so, from our perspective, when we talk about sustainable supply chain, it's all those things. It's environmentally responsible, it's socially responsible, there's good governance, but there's also a really deep knowledge of, first of all, who are your first level suppliers. First of all, that's the adding and subtracting that we've got to get right before we go to the calculus of, the end tier. But, we're heavily involved in all of those things with all of our clients to help them mitigate risk.
Sure. And if I am, for example, a company on your platform and I'm looking down through my suppliers, is it possible for me to identify which suppliers would add the most to my emissions, for example, given that, 90% of most organizations' emissions come from their supply chain? I'm guessing the best way, well, I'm not guessing, I know the best way to reduce your emissions is to source from suppliers that themselves are low emissions, given that 90% of your emissions come from your supply chain.
Yes, Tom. I mean, it's a great point. And yes, when we are working with large buyers, we have two different ways that we can help large buyers. One is, first of all, you're right, 90% comes from their supply chain, but especially if they're a manufacturer, of course, they could have a big footprint. And so one of our solutions actually connects to the different machines that may be being used to measure the energy used and the carbons being emitted by their own machines, and align that with a project management capability that allows them to track towards whatever their for example, if they have a net zero goal that's time driven. And so there's a solution there that actually helps the buyers with their own tracking of that. But you're exactly right. Most of it comes from the supply chain. And so, as you know, Tom, the gathering that information about carbon footprint and energy usage from the supply chain traditionally is done through surveys, through communication where the supplier is actually representing what they found about their own internal study. But one of the things that we've been able to do with some advanced technology is we can do the questionnaires, and we do that with multiple tiers in the supply chain. But we've also developed, using some advanced technology, an extrapolation model that will take all the public documents from all the public companies that are required to disclose their ESG progress and the way that they're measuring it, and capture that. Most of them are PDFs posted on websites. The technology captures that, translates it into metrics that feed the various frameworks. And based on the country and the industry that they're in, we can instantaneously, we have customers with hundreds of thousands of suppliers, instantaneously score their suppliers based on the publicly available information extrapolated into industry and region of the world, and help our clients get to a place where they can rapidly identify what potential opportunities would be and use a platform like ours to reach out to that supplier to work on remediation. So it's something that is not just for the global good either. I think the world's largest companies look at it as a profit issue, and it's fascinating how that is evolving, where the capitalism of the whole thing is also driving it, which is, I think, ultimately a key to this being a long-term area of investment and progress, most importantly for the world's largest buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of organizations, you have pressures coming from their investors, but you've also got pressures coming from their customers. You've got pressures coming from their employees. So if you have a good sustainability story, you find it easier to recruit and retain good candidates. And as well, you find it easier to recruit new customers and keep them as well. So, I think that's the point you were making about profitable, but maybe you had another spin on it.
No, you nailed it perfectly. I mean, the investors, employees, customers, they are also getting smarter and smarter and looking past the PR and looking for progress and practical proof, that, hey, we need to understand really the outcome, the outcomes that you're achieving, the actual progress. And so solution providers has to play a key role in that, because the world is moving to practical, not political, around this issue. And I think it's a very, very positive development.
And speaking of PR, I mean, how can you be sure, or how can I be sure, or how can investors be sure, or employees be sure, or customers be sure that this is not greenwashing, that this is actual hard data backing up these claims?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, and it's why we're so excited. We made an equity investment in acquisition of a company that has this technology to actually capture it off of machines. And depending on how big a supplier is to a large buyer, we are starting to see that the buyers are requiring suppliers to not just produce a PDF representing, what a claim about the progress they're making in reducing their carbon emissions, but looking for hard data. And so I think that's going to be also something else, Tom, that starts to become more and more prevalent is, I appreciate the PR, but I need the proof.
Yeah, exactly. No, that makes a lot of sense. And for solution providers for global 2000 companies. What do you think are the biggest challenges when it comes to implementing new tools for managing ESG goals and complying with global regulations, which we haven't touched on yet, but are really, really moving fast as well?
Yeah, I mean, we use this analogy a lot internally. When we decided to go to the moon, we didn't start off designing the little buggy that that the folks were going to ride around on. We started off designing the jet propulsion and the life sustaining systems in the rocket. And so your question is a really important one. It's like, how do we, how do we get there? And I think it's very important to take a look at, boy, the first thing we need to do is understand, first of all, who our suppliers are. Who do we do business with, and have good information about them. And then once that relationship is formed and the trust is formed, start to have a platform where information can be shared. So there may not be a public company. You're asking them questions about, their own operations, all the way down to, gosh, where are you building things and what's your bill of materials, which is very sensitive to, to suppliers. It's a competitive advantage for many of them. And so there has to be that trusted relationship that's set up. And so, there are some real important kind of blocking and tackling things that need to happen first. And then from there, you can progress towards, boy, there's trust there. Let me share with you our expectations of you as a supplier. You're making this widget. You're claiming that this is the carbon emission that's being produced as a result of that. We need to see proof. If you don't have a way of developing the proof, then we've got suggestions on tools that you can implement, and so we're starting to see. It's not at scale yet. We've got our customers have hundreds of thousands of suppliers. It's hard to do that immediately, but very strategically with the large suppliers and the ones that are making things and shipping them that have a lot of carbon emissions associated with them, we're starting to see this relationship being more of a partnership around this issue between buyer and supplier.
And how much of it is compliance driven versus how much of it is companies just, being best in class versus, I think the point I'm trying to get to is, can supply chain sustainability and transparency, can that actually evolve into becoming a competitive advantage? Do you think that's something that's likely to happen? Has it happened already? Or will it happen in the next few years? Or, how much of this is, as I said at the start, compliance driven? Where are we on that kind of scale?
Yeah, Tom, really great question. From a compliance perspective, all of the different regulations that have been put in place, but also that are on the way. They're not getting fewer, in other words. So there's regulation on the way for sure. And I think that is driving some of the conversation. But I will say also that, these large buyers, and again, that's the main experience that we have the last 30 years, pretty much exclusively in the Fortune 1000. So that's the experience that I can speak from. Sure. Large companies, even before these regulations happen, I'll go back 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. Nobody wants a supplier that's been convicted of dumping a bunch of waste in river or has a human rights violation. And so there's some kind of common truths about, who I think as human beings we want to do business with. And so I think the beautiful part about what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years, especially that's accelerated over the last couple, is, there are ways to kind of create systems that can help these buyers make sure that that they feel good when they leave work that day, that they did something good. And so I think that's been around for a while, Tom, but I think it is accelerating. And to the extent that there are people and solutions that can help them reliably have accurate information about that, I think they're going to do well, and I think it's going to be in high demand.
Okay. We've talked a lot about the E in ESG. What about the two other letters, the S and the G? Can you talk a little bit about the social and governance?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, the key technology that any provider needs to have that's helping a company evaluate that is the ability to really look in the nooks and crannies of all the news cycle and even the dark web and just span the globe for information about what's going on with suppliers and what they've been convicted of or what's going on with them in the dark web. And so, we haven't really talked about cybersecurity, but it all plays into the same issue of, boy, I want to responsibly allocate the resources that I have as a large company to the right suppliers that are doing the right things. And so, the ability to go and monitor around the world what's going on in the news cycle is very important to understanding, are people being environmentally responsible?
Sure.
And so that's a key part of, as a solution provider, what we rely on to help our companies understand what's going on there. From a cyber perspective, there's applications, and we made an equity investment, did an acquisition this year for a company that it does nothing but that, looking for weaknesses at suppliers in their supply chain. The reason this is important is, as I mentioned earlier, when things are stolen from large companies and traded on the dark web and sold, the funds that are changed hands as a response to that are not, they're not good things being done with that money. And so from an environmental perspective, you can span the globe looking for infractions, lawsuits, guilty pleas, and create a score around that. You can also have suppliers self-represent what things are going on in their business and have a mechanism to collect that. And then from a governance perspective, it's really the hardest one. I mean, ultimately, it's looking at a supplier. Do they have incentive practices, for example, that align with the best interests of our client or the stated objectives of that company? And so some of that is subjective. Questionnaires are a great way to get to that. Also using news monitoring to monitor, are there some lawsuits happening between board members, that sort of thing. But you're right. Both of those, really all three of those, what's going on in the environment and what's happening socially and what's happening in the governance environment, it all plays into and can be scored to help a client figure out whether or not, boy, I want to continue to do business or not with this supplier.
Yeah. It's a very immature space, Steve, isn't it? I mean, there aren't really reporting standards per se. We're starting to see them in the emissions space, sure, but particularly for social and governance, less so. Do you think that's going to be something we'll see change in the coming years?
I think it will, Tom. I mean, we have the privilege of working with some folks in Washington, and so we have an opportunity to understand the things that are being talked about around this topic. And so I think that there's going to be an attempt, just like there has been around some of the environmental things. You're right; it is going to be more difficult, but from our perspective, we can stay pretty focused on the things that we know large buyers care about. And it's, boy, if you've been convicted of modern slavery violation, most likely that's going to be in the news, and that's something that is pretty easy to grasp and put in front of a client so that they can make a decision around. And the important thing is, for folks like Apex and other solution providers, it's also to focus all this information, because there's all these signals of risk that are happening, especially if you have hundreds of thousands of suppliers. And so systems that can consume these faint signals of risk and translate them into an outcome, which is, boy, we've got a child labor law violation. There's the email compromise from that same supplier. There's a new login from Nigeria that we've never seen before. And they just changed a bank account to something that the bank says doesn't really connect with that vendor in any way. So, what suppliers need to do that are helping companies with this is to create outcomes, and that is consume all of those faint signals of risk, work with the client on how they want a decision from those signals, and then reach into the ERP, for example, and put that vendor on hold until somebody releases it. And so that's I think a thing we've had a lot of fun with is taking all of this information and putting it in our neural engine and training the neural engine to the client's requirements so that it can actually produce an outcome to reduce risk or reduce, the reliance on suppliers that are harming the world.
Nice. Yep. And where to next? I mean, where do you see the likes of sustainable supply chains moving in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah, Tom. I mean, I think that this, and you asked the question earlier, is a really important question about how do we progress and how do we get there faster. I think ultimately the world's buyers who are responsible for distributing the blessings of their resources to the world's suppliers, they are, I believe, are going to take a more and more active role in working with those suppliers to mitigate the risks that are there, the environmental risks, help them eliminate the exposure they have across their own supply chain to modern slavery, for example. And so I really anticipate we're starting to see this in the world's largest companies is taking a more active role in sort of managing and mentoring their supply chain, but not manually. It's going to be using technology.
Sure.
And I think the pace with which the change for good happens is going to rapidly accelerate due to that.
Yeah. I mean, it can't be done manually. Otherwise, it wouldn't scale. It has to be automated.
No.
Yeah.
That's right.
Totally.
That's right.
Steve, we're coming towards the end of the podcast now. Is there
Yes, sir.
any question I didn't ask that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
No, I mean, Tom, I think that you've covered the things that certainly our clients are asking us about around these topics. I think the journey that you're on to make these things front and center to the solution providers of the world, but also to the buyers and the suppliers, I think is really important. And I think they're universal things. They're universal goodness that solution providers and buyers can drive in the world. And I think it's really important. It's really important to do so.
Super. Great. It's nice to hear. Fantastic. Good. Steve, that's been really interesting. If people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Yeah, Tom, www.apexanalytix.com, analytics with an X. And there you'll get a look at all of our different client stories and the things that we help them with. And then also we actually put on an ICON conference. It's a conference of our customers and other Fortune 1000 companies to get together and talk to each other about these issues and how they're being solved. Some of the times we talk about our solutions, some of the times we don't. It's really, we put it on to get the world's largest companies together to help each other get better and improve and share solutions. And so that's another way that someone could interact with us. But that information's on our website as well.
Fantastic. Steve, that's been great. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure, Tom. Have a good day. Thank you.